The sun was merciless that afternoon, a blazing fire stretching endlessly across the desert sky. Heat waves rose from the cracked sand, shimmering like illusions. In the middle of that desolation stood Sarah, a young woman 6 months pregnant, clutching her swollen belly as her husband's car sped away, leaving a trail of dust that stung her eyes. Her trembling hands reached out toward the shrinking figure of the car. "David, please don't leave me here. I'm carrying your child." Her voice cracked, breaking apart in the dry, suffocating air. But David didn't even glance back. His expression behind the wheel was cold, carved in stone. He had already made up his mind. To him, Sarah was nothing more than a burden now, an obstacle to the glittering life waiting for him with Linda, the wealthy businesswoman who had promised him success, fortune, and status. Sarah was simply excess baggage, a reminder of vows he no longer intended to keep. The tires kicked up sand and stones. The car disappeared into the horizon, leaving Sarah standing alone. Silence swallowed her, except for the howling of the desert wind. Sarah collapsed to her knees, her breath shallow, her tears mixing with sweat. Why are you doing this to me, David?" she whispered, as though speaking to the empty sky. Her baby shifted inside her, a painful reminder that she was not only fighting for herself, but for the fragile life within. Her lips were parched. The bottle of water David had tossed at her feet, almost like feeding an animal, rolled uselessly in the sand. She picked it up with shaking hands, her pride crushed under the weight of betrayal. This wasn't just about abandonment. It was humiliation. Sarah had once believed in David's love. She had given up her job, her dreams, everything to build a family with him. She thought he was her safe place. But now, that safe place had turned into a grave of despair. The sun climbed higher, burning her skin. Hours passed. Her legs wobbled as she tried to walk, each step heavier than the last. She thought of her parents, who had begged her not to marry David. She thought of the nights she spent alone while David worked late. The signs had always been there, but she chose love over truth, her vision blurred. She stumbled, her body too weak to carry her any farther. She fell face first into the sand, coughing, her heart pounding like a drum. Somewhere, faintly, she thought she heard the sound of bells. Or was it the distant bleating of sheep? Maybe her mind was playing cruel tricks. She pressed her cheek to the scorching sand, whispering a silent prayer. "God, don't let me die here." Her eyes fluttered shut, darkness closing in, and then footsteps. Slow, steady, crunching against the dry ground. A shadow fell across her body, blocking the merciless sun. A rough, calloused hand reached down toward her. Sarah's lips parted, her last breath trembling as she wondered, was this salvation or the end? Before the desert, before the betrayal, Sarah had once been the kind of woman who believed in fairy tales. At 27, she thought her life was set. She had fallen in love with David during her college years, charmed by his sharp smile, his lofty dreams, and his sweet words about a future together. Her friends warned her he was ambitious to a fault, but Sarah chose to see only the man who promised her forever. She gave up a promising career in design to support him. David had said, "I'll take care of us. You won't have to lift a finger." And she believed him. She became a homemaker, pouring her days into building a warm nest for the family they were supposed to grow together. When she found out she was pregnant, she cried tears of joy. She imagined David's excitement, the nursery they would decorate, the life that was waiting just around the corner. But slowly, cracks began to show. David came home late, carrying the smell of perfume that wasn't hers. His phone was always turned face down, buzzing at odd hours. Whenever Sarah asked questions, he snapped, "Stop being paranoid. I'm doing this for us." And because she was in love, because she was hopeful, she swallowed her doubts and stayed silent. Her parents had their suspicions too. They saw the way David looked at Sarah with less tenderness than before, the way he seemed distracted even at family dinners. "Sweetheart," her mother had whispered one evening, "sometimes love blinds us. Be careful." But Sarah brushed it off, convinced that her marriage, though imperfect, was still built on love. She had no idea that David was already planning his escape, that behind the scenes he had found someone else, someone older, wealthier, and more powerful. Linda, a woman who promised him connections, luxury, and influence. For David, Sarah's pregnancy was no miracle. It was a chain, a weight that would slow him down from chasing the world he thought he deserved. Still, Sarah remained devoted. She cooked his favorite meals, pressed his shirts, and waited by the window every night for the sound of his car. She didn't know those were the final days of her old life. She didn't know that the man she trusted with her future would soon drive her into the middle of nowhere and leave her to die under the scorching sun. Looking back now, lying weak in the desert, she realized love had made her blind. She had given everything, her youth, her trust, her body carrying his child, and in return, David had given her betrayal. But as the shadow of the stranger's hand hovered above her on the sand, Sarah's story was about to take a turn. This was not the end. This was the beginning of something she could never have imagined. Because the silent shepherd who found her was no ordinary man. The desert was not just a place, it was a living beast, merciless, vast, and unfeeling. The sky stretched wide, a cruel canvas of blue without a single cloud. The ground beneath Sarah's swollen feet burned like fire, each grain of sand biting her skin as though the earth itself rejected her presence. There were no trees, no shade, no signs of rescue. Just an endless sea of dunes, shifting and rising, mocking her weakness. Every gust of wind felt like a slap. It carried grains of sand that stung her eyes, dried her lips, and scratched her skin raw. Sarah tried to shield her face with trembling hands, but her arms were heavy, her body drained. The baby inside her kicked faintly, reminding her that she wasn't alone in her suffering. She whispered through cracked lips, "Hold on, little one. Please hold on." The silence of the desert was deafening. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, no human voices, only the howl of the wind stretching for miles in every direction. Sarah had grown up in the city, where life buzzed with cars, neighbors, and laughter from apartment windows. Now she was stranded in the cruelest kind of loneliness. The desert wasn't just empty, it was hostile. Time twisted in that place. Minutes felt like hours. Hours felt like days. She lost track of how long she'd been walking, stumbling, falling, then crawling on her hands and knees. The sun showed no mercy. It baked her skin, making sweat evaporate the moment it formed. The bottle of water David had tossed at her feet was already half empty. She rationed it carefully, but thirst clawed at her throat, making her lips split and bleed. Her mind began to betray her. She thought she saw an oasis ahead, green trees, shimmering water, but when she reached out, it vanished into thin air. Mirage after mirage played tricks on her, offering hope only to rip it away. Each time her heart broke a little more. She remembered her wedding day, the vows spoken in front of family and friends. For better or worse, in sickness and in health. How cruel those words sounded now, echoing in a place where death felt closer than life. David had spoken them, looking straight into her eyes, and yet here she was, discarded like she was nothing. Her knees buckled. She collapsed onto the hot ground, sand burning her skin through the thin fabric of her dress. Her chest heaved, desperate for air, her vision darkening at the edges. If she closed her eyes now, maybe it would end. Maybe the suffering would stop. Maybe her baby wouldn't have to feel the ache of betrayal that had shattered her heart. Her head tilted sideways, resting against the scorching sand. And just when she thought it was over, she heard something, soft, steady, and out of place. The faint bleating of sheep, carried through the desert wind. Sarah's eyes flickered open. Was she hallucinating? Or had someone truly found her in this barren graveyard of hope? While Sarah lay abandoned in the desert, fighting for her life and her unborn child, David was miles away, his conscience as dry as the sand he had left her in. For him, the past 6 years of marriage had become nothing more than a cage. He wanted wealth, power, a life that glittered with luxury. And Sarah, gentle, trusting, pregnant Sarah, no longer fit into that picture. David had always been ambitious. Even in college, he talked about owning penthouses, driving sports cars, and mingling with the elite. But ambition without morals is poison. While Sarah dreamed of a cozy home and a family filled with love, David's dreams were of champagne parties, expensive suits, and powerful connections. When he met Linda, the wealthy businesswoman who controlled half the city's high-end hotels, he saw his escape. Linda was older, sophisticated, and ruthless in her dealings. She made David feel important, feeding his ego with promises of influence and a seat at her side. "With me," she whispered one night, "you won't have to live small anymore." Those words were all David needed. Sarah's love no longer mattered. Her pregnancy was an inconvenience, a chain that threatened to anchor him in mediocrity. In his mind, abandoning her was not cruelty. It was survival. That morning, as he drove Sarah into the desert, he didn't feel guilt. He felt freedom. He watched her plead, her eyes wide with disbelief, and he hardened his heart. "You'll be fine," he lied flatly, tossing the water bottle at her feet. Then he slammed the car door, ignoring her cries as though she were nothing more than background noise. Driving back toward the city, David smiled for the first time in months. He pictured the future. Sitting beside Linda at her grand gala, dressed in tailored suits, clinking glasses with the city's elite. He imagined people finally respecting him, no longer just another struggling man with an ordinary wife. With Linda, he would rise. With Sarah gone, no one could hold him back. Yet, deep down, there was a flicker of unease. He shoved it away quickly, drowning it with the roar of his car engine. Conscience was for weak men, he told himself. He had chosen power over love, and in his world, that was the only choice that mattered. By the time he reached the luxury hotel where Linda was waiting, Sarah was nothing but a shadow in his mind. Linda greeted him with a smile that promised everything he craved. She placed her hand on his chest and whispered, "Tonight, the city will know you belong to me." David grinned, hungry for the spotlight, blind to the storm that was already brewing. Because while he celebrated his future, the woman he thought he had buried was about to rise stronger than he ever imagined. The world Sarah once knew had collapsed in the desert. She thought nothing could wound her more than the moment David drove away, leaving her to die. But fate was crueler. Sometimes the deepest cuts weren't made in silence, but under the eyes of others, where humiliation became a spectacle. News traveled quickly in the city. David and Linda were no longer hiding. Hand in hand, they appeared in glittering hotels, walking past cameras, smiling like royalty. Their faces were plastered across magazines and gossip blogs. Headlines shouted, "Business tycoon Linda seen with young handsome partner." Another article read, "Could this be the city's new power couple?" Sarah saw it all. She was sitting in Elias's small hut at the edge of the desert, still weak from dehydration, when a young shepherd boy ran in carrying a discarded newspaper. She stared at the photo, her heart breaking all over again. There was David, her husband, the father of her unborn child, holding another woman's hand as though their years together had never existed. Tears blurred her vision. She pressed the paper against her chest, whispering, "How could you, David? After everything I gave up for you, how could you humiliate me like this?" The shame was unbearable. She imagined neighbors back in the city whispering, her parents finding out, her friends shaking their heads in pity. She had been erased, replaced, and discarded in front of the world. Meanwhile, David basked in the attention. Cameras loved him. Reporters followed him. He wore expensive suits Linda bought, posed beside her luxury cars, and toasted at rooftop parties. He told himself Sarah was nothing but the past, a mistake better forgotten. With every flash of the cameras, he felt more alive, convinced he had made the right choice. But Sarah's pain wasn't invisible. In the quiet of the desert night, Elias saw her break. He watched her sit outside, staring at the endless sky, clutching her belly as if holding herself together. She spoke softly, almost to herself. "I don't matter to him anymore. But what about this child? Am I supposed to let my baby grow up in shame as the child of a discarded wife?" Elias didn't answer then. He only placed a bowl of water beside her, his silent presence offering the comfort words couldn't. Yet his eyes, steady and watchful, carried a promise she couldn't yet understand. Back in the city, whispers began to grow. Not everyone was convinced by David and Linda's romance. Some said Linda was simply using him, that he was just a pretty ornament on her arm. David ignored the talk, intoxicated by luxury. But gossip has sharp teeth, and soon Sarah's story, the abandoned pregnant wife, would begin to surface. And when Sarah finally saw David and Linda together with her own eyes, the wound of betrayal would cut deeper than she ever imagined. Night in the desert was colder than Sarah had ever imagined. The same sun that burned her skin during the day now left her shivering under a thin blanket Elias had given her. She sat outside the shepherd's hut, staring at the flickering lantern he had hung near the doorway. The world felt impossibly silent, and in that silence, her heart screamed louder than ever. Images of David's betrayal replayed in her mind like a cruel film. his face as he turned the wheel and drove away. The mocking headlines showing him beside Linda, the smile on his lips, the same smile that once belonged to her alone, each memory cut into her like shards of glass. Her chest ached with grief. She pressed her palm against her swollen belly, whispering, "I'm sorry, my baby. I'm so sorry you have to feel my pain." Her voice cracked, dissolving into sobs that shook her fragile body. For the first time, Sarah felt completely broken. She wasn't just abandoned. She was erased, forgotten, humiliated. She curled into herself, tears soaking the blanket, convinced she had nothing left. What was she without David? What was she without the life she thought they would build? Even breathing felt heavy, as if despair was pressing down on her lungs. Inside the hut, Elias listened quietly. He had been mending a tool by the fire, but the sound of Sarah's muffled cries pulled at something deep within him. He didn't rush outside. He knew pain wasn't something you could fix with quick words. Instead, he moved slowly, his footsteps steady, until he stood beside her in the cold. Sarah looked up, startled, wiping her face with trembling fingers. Elias didn't speak. He simply draped his heavy coat over her shoulders and sat down on the ground next to her. For a while they both stared at the stars, the silence between them strangely comforting. Finally, Sarah whispered, "Why would he do this to me? What did I do to deserve being thrown away like garbage?" Her voice was raw, almost pleading for an answer. Elias turned his gaze toward her, his eyes calm, filled with something she hadn't felt in a long time: understanding. "Some men," he said quietly, his voice low and rough, "don't see the value of what they already have. They chase shadows, thinking they are light, and when the truth comes, they're left with nothing but regret." His words sank into her heart. For the first time since David left her, Sarah felt the sting of hope flicker. Someone saw her pain, someone understood. She didn't thank him, she couldn't. Instead, she leaned slightly toward him, letting his presence carry her through the storm inside her chest. Elias didn't move. He simply stayed, a silent guardian against the weight of the night. The desert wind howled again, but it no longer felt like mockery. Wrapped in Elias's coat, Sarah let her tears fall freely, no longer ashamed of her brokenness. What she didn't know was that Elias carried a secret, one that would soon change everything. For days, Sarah found unexpected comfort in Elias's silent presence. He spoke little, yet every gesture carried meaning. He shared his food with her, fetched water from the well, and even fixed a broken stool so she could sit more comfortably. To Sarah, who had been discarded like nothing, this quiet kindness felt like a lifeline. But just as she began to trust in this fragile routine, something changed. One morning, when Sarah stepped out of the hut, Elias was gone. His coat was missing, his walking stick too. She called out softly, "Elias?" The desert answered only with wind. At first, she told herself he had gone to tend the sheep, but hours passed and he didn't return. The flock wandered restlessly without his guiding presence. The sun slid down the sky, shadows stretching long, and still there was no sign of him. Fear crept into Sarah's chest. What if he wasn't coming back? What if this too was abandonment? The thought clawed at her, like an old wound reopening. She wrapped her arms around her belly, whispering to the child within, "Not again. Please, not again." That night she lit the lantern herself. Watching its dim glow flicker in the dark, the silence was heavier without Elias nearby. She found herself listening for the crunch of his boots, the low whistle he used to call the sheep, any sound that proved he hadn't vanished for good. But the night stretched on, empty and unkind. The next day, hunger gnawed at her. She tried to mimic Elias's task, scattering feed for the flock and drawing water from the well. Her hands shook, spilling more than she managed to carry. Every mistake reminded her of how dependent she had become on his strength. And still, there was no sign of him. By the third day, Sarah's hope began to crumble. The memory of David's betrayal pressed on her chest, whispering that she was destined to be left behind again and again. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she sat on the dusty floor of the hut, whispering, "Why does everyone leave me? What did I do to deserve this life?" And yet, a different thought crept into her mind. What if Elias wasn't who he seemed? He had always been kind, yes, but also secretive. His eyes sometimes carried a weight she couldn't explain. Maybe he had hidden motives. Maybe his silence covered a truth she wasn't ready to hear. The desert outside rumbled with distant thunder, a rare storm gathering on the horizon. Sarah hugged herself tighter, listening to the winds howl against the frail wooden hut. Each crash of thunder felt like a drumbeat of fear in her chest. Then, just as despair was about to consume her, she heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, drawing closer through the storm. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Was Elias finally returning, or was someone else standing at her door? The storm raged outside, thunder echoing across the desert, as if the heavens themselves were tearing apart. Sarah clutched the edge of the blanket, her heart pounding wildly. The footsteps grew louder, steady and unhurried, until a familiar figure appeared in the doorway. It was Elias. Relief crashed over her like a wave, but almost immediately confusion followed. Something about him was different. Gone was the weathered shepherd's coat she had grown used to. Instead, he wore a dark, tailored jacket, the kind she had only seen in magazines. His boots were polished, his posture sharper, more commanding than before. Even his eyes carried a new intensity, a quiet authority that hadn't been there earlier. "Elias," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling between gratitude and fear. "Where have you been?" He didn't answer right away. He set down a leather bag, rain dripping from its corners, then lit the lantern inside the hut. His movements were calm, precise, almost too deliberate. Finally, he turned to her and said, "I had to take care of something. But I promised you, you're not alone anymore." The words warmed her heart, yet unease lingered. She wanted to ask where he had gone, why his clothes looked like they belonged to a man of wealth, not a shepherd scraping by in the desert, but exhaustion silenced her. She simply nodded, too grateful he had returned at all. Over the next hours, Sarah noticed more changes. He carried supplies she had never seen before. Fresh fruits, medicine, fabric that looked expensive. When she asked how he managed to get them, Elias only said, "I have ways." He spoke with a quiet certainty that made her wonder if she had ever truly known him at all. That night, as the storm subsided, Sarah lay awake on the thin mat, listening to the steady rhythm of Elias's breathing. Questions swirled in her mind. Who was this man who had saved her? Why did his presence feel both safe and mysterious at once? And why, despite the fear of the unknown, did her heart beat faster every time his eyes met hers? For a woman who had been discarded like trash, Elias's care was a lifeline. But now there was something more. An unspoken current between them, a pull she couldn't deny. She hated herself for feeling it, for letting her heart stir when her marriage hadn't even ended. But David had abandoned her. David had chosen someone else. And Elias had stayed. Still, she couldn't escape the feeling that Elias carried a secret too heavy for words. Something about his silence, his sudden disappearances, the way he avoided certain questions, it all pointed to a truth waiting to be revealed. Sarah closed her eyes, clutching her belly. "Please," she whispered to the night, "don't let him hurt me too." At the doorway, unseen in the shadows, Elias stood watching her sleep, his expression unreadable. Because the truth was simple. Elias was no ordinary shepherd, and soon Sarah would discover exactly who he really was. In the days that followed, Sarah noticed details she could no longer ignore. Elias might have lived like a shepherd, but nothing about him was ordinary. His hands, though calloused, bore the marks of someone who hadn't always worked the land. His speech, though simple, carried the weight of education. And the supplies he brought back after his mysterious absences, fresh meat, clean linens, medicine sealed in expensive packaging, were things no poor shepherd could afford. One morning, Sarah stepped outside to find Elias repairing a broken lantern. She watched him, studying the way he moved. Even the smallest task he performed with precision, as though he was accustomed to leading, to commanding. Finally, she asked, "Elias, who are you really?" He looked up, his eyes steady, but he only smiled faintly and replied, "Someone who knows what it feels like to lose everything." His answer, though kind, was no answer at all. Still, the questions kept piling up. When Sarah accidentally touched the leather bag Elias had brought during the storm, she discovered documents tucked inside. They weren't in detail she could understand, but the paper was embossed with golden seals, and the signatures belonged to people she had only seen mentioned in business magazines. She froze, her heart racing, and quickly returned the bag before Elias could notice. Her suspicion grew stronger when a sleek black car appeared on the desert road one evening. Sarah watched from the doorway as Elias walked out to meet it. Two men in suits stepped out, bowing their heads with respect. They handed him a folder and spoke in hushed tones, their demeanor the opposite of how one would treat a poor shepherd. When Elias returned, Sarah didn't ask. She couldn't. But the truth glimmered at the edges of her mind. Elias was living a double life. At night, as she lay awake, Sarah wrestled with conflicting emotions. She'd been thrown away by a man who valued wealth and power more than love. And now, here she was, under the protection of another man who clearly possessed both. But Elias was different. He never flaunted it. He never used his strength to belittle her. He offered kindness without asking for anything in return. She wanted to trust him, but fear still lingered. What if he's like David? She whispered to herself. What if he's only pretending? One evening, Elias found her crying quietly, clutching her stomach as the baby kicked. He knelt beside her, placing a gentle hand near hers. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he said softly. His words were steady, but his eyes betrayed something deeper, an unspoken truth he was holding back. Sarah's breath caught. She wanted to demand answers, to shake the truth from him. But before she could speak, Elias stood and walked toward the open desert, his figure tall against the fading light. Because the time was coming when Elias's true identity would shatter everything Sarah thought she knew. Sarah woke one morning to find Elias already waiting by the door. His expression was calm, but his eyes carried a quiet urgency. "Come with me," he said simply. His voice left no room for refusal. Her heart raced. "Where are we going?" she asked, clutching the shawl around her shoulders. "You'll see," Elias replied. He led her across the desert path where, to her shock, a sleek black car was parked, its polished surface gleaming beneath the rising sun. Sarah froze. A shepherd did not own a car like this. Before she could speak, Elias opened the door for her with a quiet nod. "Trust me." Nervously, she climbed in. The leather seats were soft, the air cool. As the car sped across the endless sands, Sarah stared out the window, her thoughts swirling. Every mile carried her farther from the broken woman David had abandoned, and closer to a truth she both longed for and feared. The city skyline eventually appeared, glittering in the distance. But the driver didn't stop at the crowded streets. Instead, they drove through tall gates, guarded by men in suits. The car climbed a winding driveway until it reached a sprawling estate, a mansion so vast it seemed unreal. Marble columns rose toward the sky, fountains sparkled in the courtyard, and gardens stretched as far as her eyes could see. Sarah turned to Elias, disbelief written all over her face. This belongs to you?" Elias didn't answer immediately. He stepped out of the car, walked to her side, and extended his hand. "It does. And now, so does your safety." Her knees felt weak as she stepped onto the polished stone steps. Inside, the mansion was breathtaking. Chandeliers hung from high ceilings, priceless paintings adorned the walls, and servants moved gracefully, bowing their heads at Elias. But he, unlike David, seemed unimpressed by the luxury. He moved through the space with ease, as though it was merely a backdrop to his life, not the center of it. "I was born into this world," Elias finally explained, his voice steady. "Wealth, power, influence, they've always been within my reach, but I lost something that all of this could never replace. My family, my peace. So I walked away. I chose a quieter life, far from the greed and emptiness I saw every day." Sarah stared at him, stunned. She thought of David, how he had chased wealth with desperation, destroying her in the process. And here stood Elias, a man who had everything David ever wanted, yet chose simplicity instead. Her heart pounded. The contrast was almost unbearable. "Why? Why show me this?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Elias looked at her with a softness that made her breath catch. "Because you deserve to know who stands beside you, and because your fight isn't over yet." Sarah's lips trembled. "What fight?" Elias's gaze darkened, filled with certainty. "The fight to take back your dignity, and to show the world who truly betrayed you." Sarah stood in the grand halls of Elias's mansion, still overwhelmed by the truth she had just learned. Only days ago she had been crawling across the desert, abandoned and forgotten. Now she was here, surrounded by wealth she could barely comprehend. But what struck her most wasn't the marble floors or the glittering chandeliers. It was Elias's quiet conviction when he said her fight was not over. For the first time since David left her, Sarah felt something stir inside her. It wasn't anger. It wasn't grief. It was strength. Elias noticed it too. You've been broken, Sarah, he said gently, but broken things can be rebuilt, stronger than before. You've let others decide your worth for too long. That ends now. His words lit a fire in her. She thought of David, smiling beside Linda, treating her like she never existed. She thought of the whispers, the gossip, the shame she had carried like a second skin. And she realized she couldn't let her story end as the wife who was thrown away. The next morning, Elias arranged for a private tutor, a poised older woman named Clara, who specialized in etiquette and presentation. We're not changing who you are, Clara said, adjusting Sarah's posture with a firm but kind hand. We're simply revealing the strength that's already inside you. Sarah practiced walking with her head high, her shoulders back. She learned to speak with confidence, to hold her gaze steady instead of dropping it in shame. In the evenings, Elias sat with her, guiding her through articles about business and society. Knowledge is power, he told her, and power is the only language David and Linda understand. At first, Sarah stumbled. She was nervous, self-conscious, still haunted by the image of her old self, meek, uncertain, desperate for scraps of David's affection. But day by day, she grew stronger. When she caught her reflection in the mirror one night, she barely recognized the woman staring back. Her eyes no longer carried only sorrow, they carried resolve. But transformation wasn't only about appearances. One evening, Elias took her to the garden where the air smelled of roses and night jasmine. Strength isn't just about standing tall in public, he said softly. It's about believing you are worth standing for, even when no one else is watching. Sarah's throat tightened. For so long she had felt worthless, unwanted. But Elias's words made her see herself differently. She wasn't just a discarded wife. She was a mother, a survivor, and soon she would be a woman who reclaimed her dignity. She pressed her hand against her belly and whispered, "We're going to be okay, little one. Mama is not weak anymore." Elias, standing nearby, heard her words and allowed himself a rare smile. But in his eyes was something deeper, something he had not yet confessed. Because while Sarah was learning to rise, Elias was preparing to reveal just how far his power could take her revenge. The days at Elias's mansion passed in a rhythm of learning and rebuilding. Sarah was no longer the broken woman who had crawled through the desert. Her posture was taller, her voice steadier, her spirit rekindled. Yet deep inside, the wound of betrayal still ached, a wound that could only be healed by facing the man who had cast her aside. That moment arrived sooner than she expected. One morning, Clara entered the study with a folded newspaper in hand. "Sarah," she said softly, "you need to see this." Sarah hesitated before taking the paper. Her eyes fell on the bold headline, "Linda Kingsley and David Hale to host annual gala, a night of elegance and power." Beneath it was a glossy photograph of David and Linda smiling like royalty, David's arm draped possessively around Linda's waist. Her chest tightened. This wasn't just a party, it was a declaration. David and Linda were flaunting their union before the entire city, daring the world to forget that Sarah had ever existed. Elias entered the room as she lowered the paper, her hands trembling. He studied her face quietly before asking, "You've seen it?" Sarah nodded, her voice trembling. "They're hosting a gala. It's like they're erasing me completely, pretending I was never his wife, never carrying his child." Her hand instinctively rested on her belly. "How can he stand there smiling when he left me to die?" Elias's gaze darkened. He stepped closer, his tone calm but firm. "Because men like David believe their actions carry no consequences. But they're wrong. This gala, it's not just their celebration. It's your opportunity." Sarah looked at him, startled. "My opportunity?" "Yes." Elias's voice carried a weight of certainty. "For the world to see you not as the abandoned wife, but as the woman who rose from the ashes. David thrives on appearances. He believes you're gone, broken, humiliated. Imagine the power when you walk into that ballroom and prove him wrong." Her heart raced at the thought, fear and twisted together inside her. Could she really face him? Could she stand tall while the man who had destroyed her life paraded his new love before the world? Clara placed a reassuring hand on Sarah's shoulder. "You're stronger than you know, and you won't be alone. We'll prepare you for the dress, the manner, the moment. When you walk into that gala, no one will ever see you as weak again." Sarah swallowed hard. Images of David's cold eyes and Linda's triumphant smile flashed through her mind. She could almost hear the whispers of the crowd, the shock when they saw her. For the first time, the thought didn't terrify her. It fueled her. She lifted her chin, her voice steady. "Then I'll go. I won't hide anymore." Elias's lips curved into the faintest smile, but his eyes burned with something deeper, vengeance. Because at that gala, the world would see not only Sarah's rebirth, but also the downfall of David Hale. The announcement of David and Linda's gala set the mansion into motion. Elias wasted no time. "If you're going to face them," he said, "you must not only walk into that room, you must own it." Sarah's heart pounded. The thought of standing in front of David again sent shivers down her spine, but she knew this was no longer just about her pain. It was about reclaiming her dignity, her voice, and her future. The first step was her appearance. Clara, with her sharp eye and elegant taste, summoned a team of stylists. Sarah sat nervously in the grand dressing room as fabrics in deep satin and shimmering silk were draped across her shoulders. "You don't need to look like anyone else," Clara said firmly. "You need to look like the woman you were always meant to be." They chose a gown the color of midnight, its flowing fabric highlighting her grace while honoring her growing belly. "You carry life," Clara whispered, fastening the dress. "There is no shame in that. It is your crown." Tears stung Sarah's eyes as she touched the mirror, seeing not a discarded wife, but a woman glowing with quiet strength. Next came her posture and presence. Clara taught her how to glide into a room, how to hold her chin high, how to silence whispers with a single look. Every evening, Sarah practiced walking across the marble halls, balancing books on her head, her movements growing more assured. But Elias's lessons cut deeper. Sitting across from her in the study, he slid articles, contracts, and reports across the table. "David thinks you're weak," Elias said, "but when you speak, you must show the world your mind is sharper than his greed." At first, Sarah stumbled over the words. Business and politics were foreign to her. But Elias was patient. He explained every detail, not as a teacher speaking to a student, but as an equal preparing a partner. Slowly, Sarah began to see the patterns of power, the games men like David played, and how to dismantle them. Yet, the hardest training was not physical or intellectual. It was emotional. One evening, Elias found her in the garden, trembling. "What if I freeze when I see him? What if I fall apart?" she confessed. Elias stepped closer, his voice low. "Then remember this. He already tried to bury you. But here you are, standing, stronger. That is your victory. Don't fight to destroy him. Fight to honor yourself." His words sank deep, like seeds taking root. For the first time, Sarah no longer feared the gala. She began to anticipate it. Days passed, and the final preparations came together. The gown, the poise, the courage, it was all ready. On the night before the gala, Clara smiled proudly. "Tomorrow, the world will see you rise." Sarah touched her belly and whispered, "Tomorrow, they'll see us both rise." And when the car arrived to take her to the gala, Sarah knew she wasn't just walking into a ballroom, she was walking into a battlefield. The night of the gala arrived, and the city buzzed with anticipation. The grand ballroom of the Kingsley Hotel gleamed under crystal chandeliers, its polished floors reflecting the shimmer of gowns and tuxedos. Reporters lined the entrance, their cameras flashing like fireworks as the city's elite stepped out of luxury cars. At the center of it all were David and Linda. They descended the staircase like a royal couple. David in a sharp black tuxedo, Linda in a scarlet gown dripping with jewels. Together they looked untouchable, the perfect image of wealth and power. David thrived on the attention. He smiled at the cameras, his arm proudly looped around Linda's waist. "Tonight," he whispered to her, "they'll all see us as the future." Linda's lips curved into a satisfied smile. She raised her glass to the crowd as if she already owned them. For her, David was a trophy, a handsome partner to display, proof of her dominance. For David, Linda was his ticket into a world he had always craved. Guests whispered with admiration as the couple moved through the room. Some called them glamorous, others envied their boldness. Few remembered Sarah, the wife discarded in the desert. To the glittering crowd, she was a ghost, erased from existence. But in the quiet corners of the ballroom, not everyone was convinced. A few sharp-eyed socialites exchanged knowing looks. Rumors had already begun to swirl. "Didn't he have a wife?" one whispered. "Pregnant, wasn't she?" another added, raising a skeptical brow. But no one dared to say it too loudly, not with Linda's sharp gaze cutting across the room like a blade. David ignored the murmurs. He basked in the spotlight, drinking in the adoration. He had climbed, he thought. He had escaped the small, ordinary life Sarah represented. Tonight was proof. The orchestra swelled, and the gala officially began. Guests raised their glasses to Linda's success in expanding her empire. David stood proudly beside her, pretending the applause was meant for him too. Yet beneath the glitter, cracks were forming. David didn't notice the way Linda's smile sometimes slipped when she thought no one was watching. He didn't notice her cold glances, as if measuring his worth against the room's other men of influence. For now, she tolerated him. But Linda was not a woman who tolerated weakness for long. As the night deepened, David felt untouchable. Toast after toast, dance after dance, his pride swelled. He whispered to himself, "Sarah is nothing but the past. Tonight, I am reborn." But far from the ballroom, another car was pulling up to the hotel entrance. The door opened and a figure stepped out, elegant, radiant, stronger than anyone expected. The crowd inside continued to laugh and drink, unaware that the very woman David had abandoned was about to walk into their world and turn it upside down. Because before the night was over, David's carefully built kingdom would begin to crumble. The gala was in full swing when the first whispers began. Outside the Kingsley Hotel, a sleek black car rolled to a stop, and a hush fell over the photographers. The door opened slowly, and Sarah stepped out. She was breathtaking. Draped in a midnight gown that flowed like liquid silk, her figure radiated strength, grace, and quiet defiance. The glow of motherhood only made her presence more powerful. The reporters, caught between shock and awe, snapped furiously, their cameras flashing like lightning. Inside the ballroom, the orchestra played, and David twirled Linda across the dance floor. He basked in the attention, oblivious to what was unfolding at the entrance. But soon, the grand doors opened, and the room itself seemed to pause. Guests turned, conversations faltered, and glasses hovered midair as Sarah walked in. Her steps were steady, each one echoing through the marble hall as if the universe itself demanded the crowd take notice. Her chin was high, her eyes unwavering. She did not look like a victim. She did not look like a woman discarded. She looked like a queen reclaiming her throne. Gasps rippled through the audience. "That's her," someone whispered. "David's wife." Another voice added, "She's pregnant, and she looks radiant." The murmurs spread like wildfire until the whole ballroom buzzed with recognition. David's laughter froze. He caught sight of her over Linda's shoulder, and the color drained from his face. His hands slipped, his steps faltered. "No," he muttered under his breath, disbelief twisting his features. She can't be here." Linda followed his gaze and narrowed her eyes, calculating. She had heard of Sarah, but assumed she was gone, erased. Now, standing before them, Sarah wasn't just present, she was commanding the room. Sarah's eyes locked on David's, and for a heartbeat, the world went silent. Memories of betrayal surged through her, his cold face in the desert, his hand on Linda's waist. But tonight, she didn't tremble. Tonight, she met his stare with fire. The guests began to shift, watching eagerly. Society loved a scandal, and this was unfolding like theater. The abandoned wife walking into the arms of her betrayer, not as a broken shadow, but as a storm. David stammered, trying to regain his composure. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" His voice cracked, betraying his panic. Sarah didn't answer immediately. She let the silence linger, the weight of it pressing against him. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm yet sharp enough to cut through the crowd. "I came to remind you, David, that the wife you left for dead still lives, and she does not hide in shame." The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, even a few claps from those who admired her courage. Linda's jaw tightened, her perfect smile faltering as she realized this was no ordinary confrontation. Elias stepped into the ballroom behind Sarah, his presence tall and unshakable. He did not need to speak. The power in his silence was enough. And as the crowd turned their eyes back to Sarah, everyone knew. The real battle was only about to begin. The ballroom held its breath. Sarah stood in the center, her gown glowing under the chandelier light, every eye locked on her. David shifted uneasily, sweat beating at his temple. He had dreamed of this night as his triumph, but now it was turning into a nightmare. "Sarah," he said again, louder this time, his voice trembling, You don't belong here." The words cut through the air, but Sarah didn't flinch. She stepped forward, each movement calm, controlled, deliberate. "No, David," she replied, her tone steady as steel. "I don't belong in the desert where you left me. I don't belong in silence erased by your lies. I belong here tonight because the truth belongs here." The crowd gasped, whispers swelling like a rising tide. David's face hardened, desperate to salvage his image. "She's delusional," he told the guests, forcing a laugh. "She's been unstable for months. You all know how pregnancy can cloud judgment." But before he could continue, Sarah's voice cut him down. "Don't you dare blame this child for your sins." She placed her hand on her belly, her eyes blazing. "Tell them, David. Tell them how you drove me into the desert with nothing but a bottle of water. Tell them how you left your pregnant wife to die." The room erupted, gasps, shocked cries, murmurs flying from one end of the hall to the other. Linda stiffened, her fingers tightening around her glass. David's mouth opened, but no words came out. His silence screamed louder than any denial. Sarah reached into her clutch and pulled out folded papers Elias had prepared. She held them high. "These," she declared, "are proof of our marriage, proof of the months I carried his child while he courted another woman. And here," she lifted a small recorder, "is his voice. A recording of him telling me that I was nothing, that Linda was his future." A staff member played the recording through the hall's speakers. David's voice filled the ballroom, dripping with cruelty. "You're holding me back, Sarah. Linda is the life I deserve. You're just baggage." The crowd erupted in outrage. Some gasped, others whispered in disgust. A few even shook their heads openly at David. "Monster," someone muttered. Sarah turned to the crowd, her voice trembling but strong. "I was his wife. I gave up everything for him, and he tried to bury me. But I am still here. I will not be erased." All eyes shifted to David, who stood frozen, exposed, stripped of his polished mask. His hands trembled, his lips moving without sound. Linda slowly stepped aside, her smile gone, her eyes narrowing with icy disdain. For the first time, David looked truly alone. And Sarah, radiant, fierce, unbroken, stood taller than she ever had. Because the moment Linda made her next move, David's fall from grace would be complete. The ballroom had turned into a storm. The recording of David's betrayal still echoed in the guests' ears, and the whispers cut through the music like knives. Faces that once looked at him with admiration now turned away in disgust. Linda's smile had vanished completely. She stood frozen, her scarlet gown shimmering under the lights, her eyes locked on David with a mixture of fury and calculation. Slowly, deliberately, she set down her glass on the nearest table. The sharp clink silenced the crowd. "Is it true?" she asked coldly, her voice slicing through the tension. "Did you really leave your wife, pregnant, alone in the desert to die?" David's face twisted with panic. "Linda, you can't believe her. She's desperate, trying to humiliate me in front of everyone." His voice cracked as he tried to laugh it off, but no one laughed with him. Linda's eyes narrowed. She had built her empire on power, on controlling narratives. And now, standing next to David, she realized she had tied herself to a liability. "Answer me, David," she pressed, her tone sharp. "Is it true?" he stammered, words tumbling uselessly. She's exaggerating, Linda. You know me. You know I'd never." But Sarah's voice cut in, steady and unrelenting. "Then deny the recording, deny your own voice." The guests murmured louder. Every second of David's silence was an admission. He looked around, searching for an ally, but all he saw were eyes filled with judgment. Linda's lips curved into a tight, bitter smile. "I see now," she said, her voice loud enough for the room to hear. "You used me just like you used her. You thought you could ride my name, my wealth, my influence, but you are nothing without me, and now everyone here knows it." Gasps filled the ballroom. David's head jerked toward Linda, his voice desperate. "No, don't say that. We're a team." "We were never a team," Linda snapped, stepping away from him. "I don't share power, and I certainly don't share my reputation with a man who abandons his own wife and child." The room erupted into whispers again, sharper this time. "She's leaving him," someone said. "He's finished," another murmured. David reached out, trying to grab Linda's arm, but she pulled back with a look of disgust. "Don't touch me," she hissed. Then she turned to the crowd, raising her chin proudly. "Ladies and gentlemen, consider tonight a lesson. Choose your partners wisely. I made a mistake and I'm correcting it now." With that, Linda walked away, her heels striking the marble floor like thunder. The crowd parted, watching as the powerful businesswoman abandoned the man she had once flaunted. David stood alone, humiliated, his face burned with shame, his throat dry. The cameras flashed, capturing every moment of his downfall. And Sarah, standing tall with Elias by her side, watched as justice finally began to unfold. But David's torment was only beginning, for the cruelest punishment was still to come. The ballroom that David once imagined as his kingdom had turned into his courtroom. Cameras clicked, guests whispered, and every glance thrown his way carried contempt. The man who entered on Linda's arm now stood abandoned, stripped of dignity in front of the city's most powerful eyes. David's hands shook as he tried to speak, but his voice faltered. "You don't understand. Sarah is lying." "No," someone in the crowd interrupted sharply. "We heard the recording. That was your voice." Others nodded, their faces grim. These were not strangers. Many were investors, colleagues, and business leaders who had tolerated David only because of Linda's influence. Without her, he was nothing. One man muttered, "A man who betrays his wife like that will betray anyone." The words spread like poison through the hall. David's reputation, once fragile, now shattered, collapsed completely. He could feel the walls closing in, the glittering chandeliers above mocking his fall. Linda was already gone, her absence like a final nail in the coffin. Without her backing, the business deals he had flaunted would crumble. The invitations to high society events would vanish, and the same people who had clapped for him minutes ago now stepped back as if he carried a disease. David staggered toward Sarah, desperation in his eyes. "Sarah, please. You don't have to do this. We can fix this. I made mistakes, but we can be a family again." The crowd erupted with disbelief. Some scoffed, others shook their heads. Sarah's face remained calm, her posture strong. "You didn't just make mistakes, David," she said softly, her voice carrying more weight than his pleas. "You tried to bury me, and now you're the one buried, under your own lies." Her words cut deeper than any blade. David's knees buckled slightly, and he reached out for balance, but no hand reached back. As the gala wound down, David found himself pushed to the edges of the crowd, ignored, avoided, invisible. His phone buzzed with messages, but they weren't offers or invitations. They were cancellations. Investors pulled out, acquaintances cut ties, opportunities evaporated. By the end of the night, David had lost everything. The woman he left his wife for had abandoned him. The empire he thought he was building collapsed into dust, and the wife he had underestimated stood taller than ever, the entire city now bearing witness to her strength. When David finally stumbled out of the ballroom, the night air hit him like a slap. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashing mercilessly. "David, did you really abandon your pregnant wife in the desert?" one shouted. "What do you have to say about Linda leaving you?" another pressed. He tried to cover his face, but there was no hiding. His shame was public now, etched into headlines, destined to follow him for the rest of his life. David had thought wealth and power would save him. Instead, they had become the stage for his downfall. And as he disappeared into the shadows, Sarah's rise was only just beginning. When the storm of the gala finally ended, Sarah stepped out of the hotel into the cool night air. Cameras still flashed, but for once, they weren't hunting her humiliation. They captured her strength, her resilience, her transformation. And as she walked down the marble steps, Elias was there, steady as ever, waiting for her. For a moment she faltered. The emotions of the night threatened to overwhelm her. The confrontation, the exposure, David's collapse. But when Elias extended his hand, just as he had in the desert, Sarah took it. The simple touch reminded her of where her journey had begun and how far she had come. Inside the car, silence filled the space between them. Sarah finally let her tears fall, not from pain this time, but from release. "I never thought I'd survive this," she whispered. "But tonight I stood in front of him and I didn't break. I felt free." Elias watched her quietly, his eyes soft, his voice low. "You were more than free. You were victorious." Back at the mansion, Sarah walked through the grand halls, not as a guest, not as someone hiding in another person's shadow, but as a woman who had reclaimed her dignity. Clara greeted her with proud tears. "You did it, my dear. The world saw who you really are." Later that evening, Sarah found herself in the garden, the night air scented with roses. She pressed her hand to her belly, speaking softly. "We made it, little one. Mama didn't let them erase us." Her voice trembled, but her words carried strength. Elias stepped out, his footsteps quiet on the stone path. "You're stronger than most people I've ever known," he said, stopping beside her. "Do you realize that?" Sarah turned to him, her eyes shimmering. "I only survived because of you. You found me when I was nothing. You saved me." He shook his head gently. "No, Sarah, I offered a hand, but you chose to rise. That strength was always inside you." The words broke something open in her heart. For months, she had been defined by David's betrayal, by humiliation, by pain. But standing here, in Elias's presence, she realized she was no longer the broken wife. She was a woman with a future, a mother ready to raise her child in love instead of fear. Her tears returned, but this time they were cleansing, soft, healing. She let them fall freely as Elias placed a hand over hers. His touch wasn't possessive, wasn't demanding. It was steady, protective, patient. For the first time since her marriage began, Sarah felt what true love might be. She looked into his eyes, searching, and saw not pity but admiration. Not desire for control, but genuine care. Her heart, scarred but beating strong, whispered an answer she wasn't ready to say aloud. Because deep down, Sarah knew her story with Elias wasn't ending. It was only just beginning. Weeks passed after the gala, and the city had not stopped talking. Headlines declared the fall of David Hale, the man who betrayed his pregnant wife for power and ended up with nothing. His name, once tied to wealth and opportunity, now carried only shame. Invitations vanished, business partners cut ties, and Linda moved on without a backward glance. David was seen wandering the streets, disheveled, avoiding the stares of those who once praised him. The luxury cars were gone, the tailored suits sold, the penthouse emptied. For the first time in his life, David had no one to impress, no spotlight to bask in, and in the quiet of his lonely nights, he was haunted by the image of Sarah, standing tall, radiant, victorious. Meanwhile, Sarah's world blossomed. Under Elias's protection, she found not only safety, but purpose. She spent mornings in the garden, evenings in the study, learning how to manage the foundations Elias had built. He didn't just give her shelter, he gave her partnership. For every lesson in power, he reminded her that kindness mattered more. The baby grew, a steady heartbeat reminding her daily that life moved forward. She prepared a nursery in the mansion, its walls painted in soft colors, filled with warmth. Clara visited often, guiding her through the changes of motherhood, while Elias ensured she never carried a burden alone. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, Sarah walked through the estate with Elias by her side. The desert stretched far beyond the gates, but it no longer felt like a graveyard. To her, it was the place where despair had ended and rebirth had begun. "Do you ever think about him?" Elias asked gently. Sarah's gaze lingered on the horizon. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but not with pain anymore. He chose his path, and I've chosen mine. He tried to erase me, but instead, he erased himself." Elias studied her for a moment, then smiled. "You've come farther than you know, Sarah. You've proven something to the world, but most importantly, to yourself." She looked at him, her heart swelling with gratitude and something more. Something she now allowed herself to feel openly. "I couldn't have done it without you." His voice softened. "You didn't need me to be strong. You already were. I just reminded you of it." In that moment, Sarah realized she was no longer bound by the chains of her past. She was free. Free to raise her child in love, free to stand tall in her own power, and free to choose happiness. And as Elias's hand found hers, steady and warm, she knew her future was no longer uncertain. It was bright, full of promise, built on truth instead of lies. David's story ended in regret, a warning to those who thought betrayal could buy them happiness. But Sarah's story was proof of something greater. That even in the harshest desert, hope could bloom again. Because no betrayal, no abandonment, no storm could destroy a woman who chose to rise. So my friends, the story has come to an end. And if you are still here with me until this very moment, it must mean something in Sarah's journey touched your heart in a way words alone cannot explain. Maybe it reminded you of your own struggles, maybe it stirred memories of loss, betrayal, or moments when you felt unseen. But most importantly, it reminded us that healing and strength are possible, even when life tries to break us. Sarah's path shows us that betrayal is not the end. It can be the beginning of a new chapter. Her husband abandoned her, but she rose from the ashes, proving that dignity and love cannot be stolen when you choose to stand tall. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus once said, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." Sarah's reaction turned her pain into power, her shame into honor. She chose to rise, and in doing so she showed us that suffering can become a teacher, not a prison. Marcus Aurelius also wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." Sarah's desert was her greatest obstacle, yet it became the very ground where she discovered her strength. And isn't that true for all of us? The darkest nights often reveal the brightest stars. So if you're going through heartbreak, rejection, or betrayal, let Sarah's story be a reminder. You are not defined by who leaves you, but by how you choose to rise afterward. If this story touched you, I invite you, like it, share it with someone who needs encouragement, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue to walk this path of stories, healing, and strength together. Because no betrayal, no abandonment, no storm can ever destroy a heart that chooses to rise.